Hi, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 11A live lesson for today. Now, this is the second lesson of Unit 3, which is complex characters in realism. The last lesson was on American realism and what the different traits and characteristics of it were. And this lesson goes into the types of characters that were popular and written during the realism movement. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Jump over to slide 5 while I move myself up into the corner. Okay, now this slide gives you the introduction. So pretty much complex means complicated, that there are a lot of different layers to something. Basically, complex characters are characters that have a lot of parts to them. There's a lot to know. They seem more realistic than characters that only have one or two personality traits. So this first section talks about how complex characters are multifaceted in personality. That means there are a lot of different sides to them. And they are not easily defined in straightforward or simplistic terms. The same way that sometimes it's hard to define a person, like if you were to think of how to describe yourself, sometimes that's rough because there are so many different sides to you. So you have to end up thinking about, well, which side is most important? Which side is this person interested in? You would often describe yourself differently in different groups. And complex characters are the same way. If a character is complex in a story, it means that you get to see different sides of them during different scenes of the story. Now they give you a note here that complex characters can be described as round characters. So that's important. That's basically what round characters are. I know that this has come up in previous English courses if you've been with us for a while. They talk about the different types of characters that can be in a story. There are flat ones, which only have one or two traits, like someone who is greedy and sneaky, but you don't find out about what their motivations are, what their background is, why they do what they do, if they are a flat character. So complex characters are round. Think of a circle. So that phrase, well-rounded, that's why they're called round characters. Complex characters are well-rounded. They know a lot and do a lot of different things that affect them in the story. Now, this bottom paragraph goes into how complex characters usually have to face challenges. If you have a simpler character, they usually zip in and out. They're there for just one purpose. If you've ever watched like a TV show when you were little and you know who the villain is, they only step in for 1 second to just do the evil thing and go, and then the heroes have to clean up their messes. That is a simple character because they're only there to do that one thing and then leave. But if you're dealing with a complex character, they usually have to go through solving problems and figuring things out about themselves. So they talk about conflicting motivations and moral dilemmas. So figuring out what the right thing to do is. Maybe one of the options that a character has will make them feel good versus what will help other people. And that person has to decide, am I more selfish than I am compassionate? Or do I care about myself more than other people? And once a character makes that sort of decision and you get to see them make that decision, you know more about them. So instead of just being someone who saves people all the time, you have the extra piece of knowing that sometimes they feel selfish and they want to take care of themselves more than other people. And even if you're not doing it on purpose, in the back of your mind, you're going to be thinking whenever they face future situations, oh, are they going to make the decision that's opposite of what they should based on what I know about them? So that's the appeal of complex characters. It gets the reader thinking about what people are going to do and why. So when a character is trying to figure out more about themselves, it helps them develop. And that basically pushes the story forward. It says here, advances the plot of the story. So usually when you're dealing with like a big hero arc, the hero has a moment where they have to decide, do I want the responsibility to put on the mask or this costume or to take up this task? And they develop when they make that decision. Either they decide, no, this isn't the life for me, or yes, I care about making the world a better place and I want to push so that people can see that. Now it says here, complex characters often have internal conflicts that cause them to question their own ideas, beliefs, attitudes, and morals. And that's exactly what I just described. These nuances may add an unexpected twist to the story. When they confront these conflicts, they commonly reveal the story's themes or act as a medium through which authors can discuss larger societal issues. So basically what they're saying is the problems that characters face in terms of how to get to know themselves is not something that's done by accident. Whenever writers have a character go through something that's difficult or frustrating, it's done on purpose so that the reader can see what the author thinks about this topic. So if you are dealing with a author that likes it when the villains end up becoming the hero at the last second, and they realize that some people who do bad things do have good motivations, then they might show that the villain ends up making a better decision than the hero in the story. So the way that a story is told, all of those little things, people don't just write in a vacuum or by accident. They pick the problems that people face on purpose to show you, the person who's reading the story, different ways that people deal with things, so that you can maybe find something relatable about the character or learn something new about how someone might resolve a problem. Sometimes we read a story and it doesn't occur to us that someone could try to solve this in a different way than we would personally until we watch them actually do it. So we get an example of this in a short story. So they give you the story of an hour, and there's a little button here so that you can listen to it. But generally, they give you the short points of the story. So the main character is a woman named Mrs. Mallard. And the story starts with a brief description of her health, especially that she has a heart condition. And that's in there because it will actually become important later. So in the story, Mrs. Mallard gets the news that her husband has been killed in a railroad accident. And they give you the excerpts here. She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. Right here. She wept at once with sudden wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room, alone, and she would have no one follow her. So she's stricken by grief, which is a normal reaction when you're hearing about someone that's that close to you, your husband, dying. She's very emotional. But when she gets alone, the writer telling the story, the narrator, talks about how she changes the more that she thinks about her husband's death. It says there was something coming to her and she was waiting for it fearfully. So her emotions are changing. And as the story goes on, you find out that she initially reacted with grief, but she has some realizations. It says, when she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her, her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath, free, free, free. So the fact that she's saying that she's free is kind of the opposite of what she initially expressed when her husband died. She was clearly, and she heard about it, she was clearly attached to him. But because this story takes place in the past where a person had to be attached to a man to be able to do anything, she realizes that she feels two different ways about it. On the one hand, she's sad that her husband has died. On the other hand, she realizes that with him being dead, she has an excuse to be alone without someone controlling her actions and decision making. And she can pretty much like move about in the world unhindered. And then it says here, her moral dilemma stems from this contradiction. So when Mrs. Mallard secretly admits that she had not always loved her husband, so she had to learn to love him, she realizes that she feels free from her marriage. She's no longer attached to anyone. And this is important because it's a reflection of how women had to survive and live at the time. Now, if we go over to slide 7, we get a little more information about the twist. So the twist at the end is that her husband, Mr. Mallard, is actually not dead. So when Mrs. Mallard sees that her husband is alive, she's so shocked, overcome by the sight, that she dies. She has a heart attack because she had a heart condition. And they gave you that information at the beginning so that it would make sense at the end when she dies. And it says, when the doctors came, they said she died of heart disease, of joy that kills. So they're saying that she was so excited by her fluctuation of emotion that it killed her via the heart attack. Now, this is kind of ironic in a couple ways, meaning that it's sort of the opposite of how it sounds. The joy that kills. So partially, she was overjoyed to learn that she would be free, basically. And technically having that taken away from her is what killed her. But to the doctors looking at her on the scene, they said the joy that kills because they assumed that she was so happy that her husband was back that the excitement killed her. But that's not quite what happened. We know what happened because we're reading the story, but they can only see how things seem on the outside. There's also irony in that the opposite ending is expected. Instead of her husband being dead and her having to figure out how to, live with her new freedom, we get the complete opposite. It's not even just that her husband is dead, or I'm sorry, that her husband isn't dead and he comes back. She's the one who dies instead, which is very unexpected. And then they give you, some more information about how important it is that affects the story. Mrs. Mallard's complexity as a character greatly impacts the development of the plot. If she were a simpler character, her reaction probably would have been one of straightforward shock and grief, right? But she wouldn't have reflected on her newfound freedom. But we know from the fact that she thought about it, that the way that her life is and the way that she came to be married must have affected her her reaction to her husband's death. So there's more in the background that affects her character than just what people see on the surface. And that's what makes a complex character. It's not just that they do a lot of cool things or have a lot of deep thoughts. What makes a complex character is the feeling that they are a full person that had a life before the point that we're reading the story. Sometimes you read books or you watch movies or you watch television shows and you don't really know where anyone came from. They just sort of show up, they're part of the show, and you just accept like, hey, this is a character in the show. But when you're dealing with a complex character, you get the feeling that not only are they a character in this book or movie or TV show, but that they were clearly doing things that were meaningful and important before the point that we get to see them. And that means that they have motivations and background that we don't get to see or that has to be explained to us later. And that's what makes a character complex. Think about it as the same way that you meet a person. When you meet someone for the first time, you know that they exist because you met them. But before that point where you met them, you didn't know anything about them. You didn't know that this person existed in the world. And as you get to know them, you get to know more about what happened in their past, in their childhood, while they were in school. What experiences motivate the type of person that you met in that moment. And that's what makes a complex character. So it's important to know that a complex character is a little more relatable to a real person. But okay. As a summary, is Mrs. Mallard. Mrs. Mallard's complicated feelings about her role as a wife is a realistic reflection of many women's situations in the early 1900s. And the reason why that is important is because realism was a movement to sort of actually depict the real struggles that people face on a daily basis. When you make a decision during your day, it's not always very simple. Sometimes you have to consider what something looks like, how it's going to affect you in the future, how other people are going to respond. And the goal of realism was to try to capture those feelings and not just write about like epic heroes that are full of virtue and goodness. Those things are great. It's great to have a hero that's full of virtue and goodness if the point of the story is to be exciting adventures. You don't want complicated feelings messing up the plot if the point is to just sort of be an exciting action-based story. But realism wanted to show what actual people were like and not just these sort of big ideas of what we think people should be. Now it says complex characters in realist literature, like real people, react to events in unpredictable ways. Their behavior reveals multiple motives and conflicting traits, and it evolves with time. Whoops. Realist characters are more believable because of these qualities. And in The Story of an Hour, Kate Chopin, that's the author, depicts two conflicting realities that shape Mrs. Mallard's response to her husband's death: grief and a desire for freedom. So it's important to note here that this wasn't a secret. Mrs. Mallard wasn't happy that her husband died. That wasn't the case. She did mourn his death because she was close to her. He was her husband. She was with him for years. But that doesn't change the fact that there's more than one thing affecting how she deals with stuff. Being a woman in the early 1900s was very restrictive. There was only so much that you could do as a woman. So even if she was sad about her husband dying, she still had to consider, well, how's my life going to move forward from here? And how is it going to be different from how it was in the past? And that's what motivated her, the twist of her personality and reflection. Okay, let's see. Oh, no. Okay. Now they give you a little summary here. The Story of an Hour centers more on the development of a character and the character's internal conflict than a sensational plot or extreme emotions. And that's important. It's centered on Mrs. Mallard and how she changes over the short course of an hour. And this focus on character development was a prominent aspect of realist literature. So they're telling you right here, the focus on character development is a staple of realist literature. So you need to remember that. And it says to develop characterization, so that's the way that you write a character, realist authors turn to the findings of psychology. So they actually studied how people think and react to things and then incorporated that into their story. It says psychology had turned into a full-fledged science by the realist period. So this is like when it was first becoming popular and taken seriously. And then they tell you round or complex characters supported realist authors' emphasis on facts and reality as opposed to imaginative constructions on plot or settings. So those are the important points to take away from this slide. So try to remember, the focus on character development is a prominent aspect of realist literature, and that round and complex characters supported realist authors' emphasis on facts and reality instead of imagining what people might be like. And you can make a small note that this is because psychology was becoming popular in a real realm of science. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So slide 11 here is William Dean Howells. So this is our reading selection, and we're learning a little bit about this author. So it says here, born in 1837, William Dean Howells was a journalist, editor, and realist author. And then they give you some more information about him. So his ideas of realism were influenced by the press because he really appreciated sticking to the truth. Like when it says the press, they mean journalism. So people who are reporting on historical events. And since professionals report only the truth the way that it happened, he was influenced by the idea that fiction should also show realistic people. So he considered strict adherence to the truth to be the highest form of art, even if it meant that the narration was about trivial, unimportant things in life. Other important things to know about him, he was an editor in chief at the Atlantic Monthly, and he pretty much was very influential to the public at the time. So he helped influence people to care about realist writing. Alrighty. So on this page, we have a 5-minute video. I'm going to give you the general summary of what it's about, and then you should pause the video. Excuse me. Pause the video to watch. But here are the general points. This video gives you more information about William Dean Howells. Pretty much more information about his background. They tell you about the other writers that he knew that were pretty famous. They tell you about some of the exciting things that he was picked for in life. He, for example, represented the US and Italy. He was chosen by President Lincoln, actually, to do this. And then they talk about some of the authors that he influenced. So these are other authors that you have heard of throughout the course of your English career. So you might recognize some of these names. He was also important because he helped introduce America to foreign writers, to show people why reading things that weren't just from America was important. So yeah, take a few minutes, 5.5, to watch this video, and then pause or meet me back at slide 13. Alrighty. If you are still listening, it means that you must have completed this video. And this slide 13, is the strategy for reading Editha. So this is William Dean Howells' story, and they give you some pointers on how to read this. So the first thing they tell you here is that most realist literature is written as social commentary. So the point of writing about how real people act in real life is so that you can express opinions as an author about what you think about how people are made to behave, the rules they have to follow, the things that they decide to do. That's the point of realist literature. It's basically to show, here's what people do, and as an author, I like this or I dislike it. So it says that the commentary is woven into the narrative. So basically, as the story describes what's happening, there will be a couple paragraphs that are peppered in that give you an opinion about how people do things. So it's important to be able to read into those paragraphs that happen in between to understand what point the author is trying to make. So they give you some pointers because identifying an author's persuasive purpose is the key to a literary analysis. So if you don't understand what they're trying to tell you with the story, that's going to make it very difficult for you to understand what the point is. So the points they give you are that you should remember that tone, that's the way that the author writes about something. So if an author writes about something that they don't like and they say like, ugh, that's terrible, you can see by the way that they're writing about something as being disgusting that the person writing the story doesn't like it, or at least that's the perspective they want to show you. So try to make a note of how certain behaviors are talked about or described in the story. That can help you figure out what the social commentary is. Also, look for persuasive arguments. So remember that persuasive arguments are when someone is trying to convince you of something. So they're explaining why something is good or bad, and they'll usually make a statement about, well, here's why most people should or shouldn't, or why most people like this or don't like this, or here are reasons. Sometimes it's just straight up, here are reasons why this is bad, or here are reasons why this is good. So try to remember that usually those persuasive arguments are made by characters themselves. So when you're reading a story, right, the author doesn't just come down from above and tell you in the story, I like what this character is doing. Basically, what they do is they use the different characters in the story to represent different points of view, because not everybody is the same. It's very easy to get a handful of people that feel a different way about the same thing. So the characters in the story usually represent different types of people. So you're going to look for the character who is either criticizing something or making a point that something is good. And if you see that person show up a lot or comment on a lot of things in a story, then that's probably the author using that character to say what they think about the subject in the story. Alrighty, let's see, anything else? Okay, it says um, a if a character's perspective aligns with the tone, that character's arguments likely represent those of the author. So remember, the tone is how the story and the author feel about a topic. So say you're reading about someone who's trying to convince their friend to go outside, right? If the emphasis, like maybe their friend doesn't want to go outside because they don't like people, maybe they get comments, maybe they're like disabled and they get comments whenever they're out and about, so they just want to stay inside all the time and they don't want to deal with it, but their friend is like, there's lots of stuff outside to enjoy and do, and the way that the spaces in between the characters talking address going outside will tell you which perspective is the author's. So if there's more emphasis on the person who wants to stay inside, then maybe the author just wants everyone to know how actually scary it is for people to make those decisions. If the emphasis is on the friend who's trying to describe the outside world as a good place and note that people are there, maybe the author wants people to know that there's hope and there are good people out there. So you want to pay attention to how the spaces in between the characters are talking to each other address a topic. And then when you find the character whose views align with those spaces in between, that's a pretty good indicator that you found what the author is trying to tell you. Because it's not realistic to have everyone just have the same opinion. It's so you have to spot, here's what the story is trying to tell me, and then this is the character that's saying the same thing that the story is. And when you put those two together, that's a very strong indicator that that's what the author thinks. So it says, read Howell's story Aditha, and as you read, consider the story's tone and persuasive arguments that the author makes throughout the story. Identifying these elements will help you understand the commentary that Howells wishes to convey in this work. And then I give you questions to keep in mind. What is the tone of this piece? And what evidence of realist thought and perspective is present in the story? So we're going to move on to slide 15 for the analysis section. Now, I know that for some people, it's easier to listen to me go through the analysis so that they know what they are looking for before they read the story. Some of these stories are old and they utilize English that's a little difficult to understand. So if you are one of those students, feel free to listen to this analysis. I'm not going to go through every single point on these slides. I'm just going to hit the major points for the analysis, and then you can go back and read. But if you are the sort of person that prefers to read and then to try to piece the puzzle together while you're doing your assignments or reading through the rest of the slides, then go ahead and pause the video, read the excerpt, and then come back here. Okay? Alrighty. So the analysis, they give you the definition of tone here, and we talked about it before, but I just want to give you a reminder. Tone is the author's attitude or feeling towards the subject that they are writing about. And you can usually tell that based on how they describe it in between the characters interacting. It says here, you can often identify a work's tone through its vocabulary and syntax. So basically how the author writes. If someone is writing using bright, happy words that describe good feelings, then they probably feel good about whatever it is they're talking about. But if they're criticizing it, calling it awful, or talking about how much harm it does or how much it disgusts them, then obviously they probably don't like the thing that they're talking about. Now here in Aditha, the lead character, Aditha herself, is willful, silly, and vapid. Now vapid means basically shallow and someone who only looks on the surface. And it says that she's a young woman with a greatly misplaced sense of self-importance. So they basically show you early on through the description who she is. And it says the author develops a sarcastic tone by describing Aditha's unexamined and unwavering belief in war as a just and noble means. So she's never been in a war. She doesn't know what war is like, but she believes that war is great because that's what people have told her. So they give you a quote here where she's basically talking about how great war is here. And um, there's some exaggerated language used to describe how she feels. So she says, that ignoble peace, it was no peace at all, what with the crime and shame at our very gates. So it says she was conscious of parroting the various phrases of the newspapers, but it was no time to pick and choose her words. So basically, she knows that she's just repeating what was in the newspapers, but she doesn't have time to come up with her own thoughts. So she thinks that it's important to just get the idea across, even if she's using someone else's words. And since the story is describing her as parroting, so that means like repeating without thinking, because that's what parrots do, they repeat sounds. That's not a good word to describe someone. If someone's like described as a parrot or a sheep, it means that they're copying or following without any thought of their own, and that's a bad thing. So the fact that the story outside of where she speaks describes her like that pretty much lets you know what kind of person she is. And then it goes on to say, she must sacrifice anything to the high ideal she had for him. So she's sacrificing even her own morals and thought processes to keep up this idea of war being a good thing. And in this story, she's trying to convince someone that she knows to go to war because she thinks it's a noble thing without thinking about how other people might think of it or how it might affect someone else. And it says here, she uses words like, or I'm sorry, the words, words such as sacrifice and high ideal are usually associated with moral fortitude. So usually if you're willing to sacrifice something, or if you have high ideals, it's usually a good thing. But because she's just pretending to on the surface, and she's just repeating what she sees in the newspaper, there's no real sacrifice or high ideal in her intention. So it's meant to be ironic. These words are being used to describe her in a way, I would say it's actually sarcastic because it's making fun of her. Okay. Now, on slide 16, we talk about mood. They give you the definition of mood. Mood is the atmosphere that's created in the story to get a feeling from the reader. So a good example of mood would be when you're reading a story about like a murder mystery. You're reading like Sherlock Holmes solving the mystery of someone's death, right? When people describe the places that he goes and what they look like, if he's dealing with a murder, the description of where he is going to be gruesome. It's going to be somber, dark, foreboding. It's going to feel creepy. And the words that they're going to use are going to describe a creepy atmosphere. And that's what mood is. So like, for example, if we were to compare this to a movie, when you get a scene that's dark, you can hear water dripping, you are working on slowly going upstairs that creak, you are going through gates that also like squeak and grind when you move them. That sets a tone, or a mood rather. It sets a mood in your head that lets you know, oh, well, this is about to be a creepy scene. It's the same in a book, just with words. The words that an author uses to describe the vibe of the scene is what a mood is. So they give you an example from this story. The mood conveyed by Editha and George is one of excitement and tension. However, the tone, so that's how the author talks about the topic, reveals Howell's disapproval for the way that Editha glorifies war. And the author uses an interaction between Editha and her mother, Mrs. Balcom, to condemn Editha's narrow vision. So this is one of those sections where the way that the story talks about Editha between her interactions with other people, it lines up with how her mom criticizes her. So that's what I was talking about earlier when you're searching for how the story lines up with how characters feel. So since Editha is being made fun of in between her interactions with people in this story. And her mom also criticizes her. You can tell that that's what the author is trying to push. Now, here's the excerpt. It says, "Why didn't he stay to dinner?" Because because war has been declared, Editha pronounced without turning. Her mother said, "Oh my," and then said nothing more until she had sat down on one of the large shaker chairs and rocked herself for some time. Then she closed whatever tacit passage of thought there had been in her mind with the spoken words, "Well, I hope he won't have to go." "And I hope he will," the girl said, and confronted her mother with a stormy exaltation that would have frightened any creature less impressionable than a cat. So basically, she's so excited about saying, like, "I hope he will," that it probably would have scared anyone else who was listening. She said it in response to her mom, like she was arguing with her, like she was yelling at her. And then it says her mother rocked herself again for an interval, that means a space of time, of cogitation. What she arrived at in speech was, "Well, I guess you've done a wicked thing, Editha Balcom." So she's basically saying, trying to convince him that he should go because you think war is cool is pretty awful. And her mom doesn't come out and say, like, "Oh, you're an awful person," but it says what she arrived at. So, like, arrived means you've gotten somewhere. You were moving and you came here. So she had to think about what she was going to say. And it says what she arrived at in speech was. So that means what she decided to say was, "Well, I guess you've done a wicked thing." Now, on slide 16, we get to, I'm sorry, 17, we get to the end of things. It says here, at the end of the story, the character of Mrs. Gearson provides additional commentary on the war. So we get more information. It says, through her speech, Howells reveals the full depth of his contempt for romantic heroism and the one-sided nature of patriotism. So I'm not going to read this all the way through because it's important for you to sort of read and grasp things for yourself. But they're describing here that Howells uses this person's speech to basically unleash the author's like full opinion of why he hates people who glorify war. And it's basically his way of using the story to criticize people who are like Editha. Like, it's important to remember that the reason why realism is important is because you can use the characters in realist stories for you to comment on how you think or what you think about people who are like them. So even though the story is about Editha, Editha is a fictional person, but she's based on people who actually feel a very specific way about war and how other people feel about war. So Howell is using this story to show interactions between people like the ones that he dislikes and people that he identifies with, to emphasize that he thinks war is not great and that people who don't fight in wars shouldn't be commenting on whether or not it's a good thing, pretty much. So we get into sort of like the plot of Editha. So it's not just commentary. There is an actual story that's happening underneath what Howells is trying to say. So the plot of Editha is pretty much a series of causal relationships. So it's the ripple effect of Editha and her connections to people and how her views affect each of those people. So we know that Editha glorifies war, right? She has a connection to George, but she convinces him to go to war because she views it as such a great thing. George does go off to war, and it's not something he wanted to do. If you read the story, you can tell that he wasn't really fond of enlisting. But Editha argued in favor of it. And because you're reading this from the outside, you can kind of tell or at least make a guess at maybe the fact that maybe George wouldn't have enlisted if she didn't feel so passionate about it. So without her influence, things could have turned out very differently. And if she hadn't been so loud and vocal about her feelings on war, maybe the people in her life would have a different opinion of her. So the story is pretty much just about her thoughts and feelings, and how that affects other people for better or worse. Okay. The next section, really quickly, is focus on language. There's just a vocabulary table here. Now, I just want to remind you, because I've had some students that I've worked with who have forgotten. If you have a focus on language table in your tutorial, that means that some of the questions in the pool of what you're going to get from your mastery test are going to be on these words. There's going to probably be like a select from the drop down the appropriate word that fits in the sentence. So it'll be very important for you to actually write down these words and at least the definition. You might not need to write down the pronunciation. You might not need to write down the other parts of speech, but it is actually important for you to have these words in your notes, because the number one issue that I have with students who need help is they need help on these specific questions. And honestly, it's a waste of a question to get help on, because you can look at the definitions that are right here. You are also allowed to, look things up to give yourself a refresher while you're on the test, but students very often forget that they can do that. So just take the time to take a screenshot or write these down, put them in your notes, part of the notes that you're going to turn in at the end of the course. And just remember to do that whenever you see a focus on language vocabulary table. And it's basically a hint, like a giant red sign, that there's going to possibly be questions about that on the mastery test. Alrighty, I think that is it for this lesson. Yep, it sure is. Okay. So that is it for this lesson. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. So this wasn't a very difficult lesson at all. It was just on complex characters. If you were having trouble with Aditha, please schedule tutoring so that we can go over the readings with you. Since we're getting to the end of these classes, we're basically in Unit 3 in terms of recording most of these classes. I do have plans to do read-throughs of the reading selections and have those recorded to go with courses as well. So if those are not up already, they should be soon. So yes, if you have quick questions, feel free to email english@atsedu.net. You can also schedule tutoring, not just with me, but also with our other English tutor, Kathy Bahovic. And I think that's it. Yep, this is Miss Amber signing off. And good luck with your English class.